Ancient Greece rests at the edge of the Mediterranean world, a land of quiet coastlines and ancient stone, where the sea presses gently against narrow peninsulas and the mountains rise in soft, gray-green waves toward an open sky. It is a place shaped as much by water as by land, where the sea was never far away, and where the light in the early morning hours falls with a particular softness across olive groves and rocky hillsides. To understand Greece is to understand, in some small way, how the world itself came to think about certain things, about how people should live together, about what is beautiful, about what is true. The geography of Greece is unusual. Unlike the broad river valleys of Egypt or Mesopotamia, where great civilizations spread across flat, fertile land, Greece is a country of fragments. Mountains divide the land into small, separate regions. Deep valleys and narrow passes make travel between communities slow and sometimes difficult. The sea, however, opens in every direction, and the Greeks became skilled sailors, navigating the Aegean and the Mediterranean with quiet confidence. Islands scattered across the Aegean, Rhodes, Lesbos, Samos, Chios, and many smaller ones, each developed their own rhythms, their own local customs, their own particular way of seeing the world. This fragmented landscape had a quiet but lasting effect on how Greek civilization developed. Rather than forming a single, unified empire governed from one great city, the Greeks organized themselves into hundreds of separate communities, each one largely independent, each one with its own laws, its own calendar, its own local gods and festivals. These communities are known as city-states, or polis in Greek, and they became the foundation of Greek political and social life. Each polis typically included a central town or city and the surrounding countryside, bound together by a shared sense of belonging and shared institutions. Despite their independence from one another, the Greeks recognized themselves as a distinct people. They shared a language, though it varied in dialect from region to region. They shared a body of myths, stories about gods and heroes that were told and retold across generations. They participated in common religious festivals and gathered at shared sacred sites. The great sanctuary at Olympia, where the Olympic Games were held, drew visitors from all across the Greek world. The oracle at Delphi, nestled in the mountains of central Greece, offered guidance to communities and individuals from every corner of the Greek-speaking world. These shared traditions created a sense of unity that existed quietly beneath the surface of political rivalry and regional difference. Greece's influence on the world that came after it is difficult to fully measure. In philosophy, in the arts, in the structure of government, in the pursuit of scientific understanding, in the way stories are told and dramas are performed, the traces of ancient Greek thought are still present in quiet ways throughout modern life. Roman civilization absorbed Greek culture deeply and passed it onward. The Renaissance looked back to Greece for inspiration. Democratic governments still carry ideas that were first carefully considered in the hills and marketplaces of Athens. The very words philosophy, democracy, theatre, mathematics, and many others come directly from the Greek language. The legacy of ancient Greece rests lightly but enduringly on much of what followed. The story of Greece does not begin with the classical city-states, however. Long before Athens and Sparta, long before the philosophers and the playwrights, there were earlier civilizations living on the islands and coastlines of the Aegean world, building palaces and trading across the sea, leaving behind traces of a sophisticated way of life that would not be fully understood until archaeologists began their patient work many centuries later. On the island of Crete, the southernmost large island of the Aegean, a civilization flourished that scholars now call the Minoan, named after the legendary king Minos, who was said in later mythology to have ruled there. The Minoans were not Greek in the way that the later classical Greeks were, but they were part of the world from which Greek civilization eventually emerged. Their culture reached its height roughly between 2000 and 1500 years before the Common Era, and what they left behind speaks of a people who were skilled craftspeople, confident sailors, and lovers of art. The great palaces of Crete, at Knossos, Phaistos, and Akrotiri, were built without defensive walls, which suggests a society that felt relatively secure, perhaps protected by the sea and by its naval strength. The palace at Knossos was an elaborate complex of rooms and corridors, light wells and storage chambers, decorated with painted frescoes that survive in fragments. These paintings show dolphins moving through blue water, young men and women performing what appears to be some kind of ritual leap over the backs of bulls, women in elaborate tiered skirts with their hair carefully arranged. There is a lightness to Minoan art, a sense of ease and grace, that is quietly striking. The Minoans traded widely across the Mediterranean and the Aegean. Their pottery and other goods have been found in Egypt, in the Levant, in mainland Greece and the Greek islands. They developed a writing system, known today as Linear A, which has not yet been deciphered, which means that the Minoans speak to us only through their objects and their paintings, not through their words. What they believed, how they organized their society, what language they spoke, these things remain gently uncertain. Around 1500 years before the Common Era, the Minoan civilization began to decline, possibly following a catastrophic volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, and the power in the Aegean world shifted to the mainland of Greece, where another early civilization had been developing. This was the Mycenaean civilization, and these people were, in a more direct sense, the ancestors of the later Greeks. The Mycenaeans spoke an early form of Greek. They built fortified palaces on hilltops, surrounded by massive stone walls, the stones so large that later Greeks looked at the ruins and believed they must have been built by giants, creatures they called cyclopes. The greatest of these centers were at Mycenae itself, at Tiryns, at Pylos, and at Thebes. These were not cities in the later sense, but palace complexes that served as administrative centers, storing grain and oil and wool, organizing labor, and directing trade. The Mycenaeans, like the Minoans before them, were active traders. Their goods have been found across the Mediterranean, and they in turn imported materials from distant places. They buried their important dead in shaft graves and later in tholos tombs, large, beehive-shaped stone chambers, accompanied by gold masks, bronze weapons, and finely made pottery. The famous mask of Agamemnon, discovered by archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century, is one of these golden burial masks, though it probably predates the legendary king of Mycenae by several centuries. The Mycenaeans also developed a writing system, known as Linear B, which was eventually deciphered in the mid-20th century and was shown to be an early form of Greek. The tablets written in Linear B are mostly administrative records, inventories of goods, lists of workers, records of offerings to gods. They are not poetry or history, but they offer quiet glimpses into the daily organization of Mycenaean palace society. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, the Mycenaean civilization collapsed, along with many other Bronze Age societies across the eastern Mediterranean. The reasons for this collapse are still studied and debated carefully by scholars. There were invasions, perhaps, movements of people from elsewhere pressing against the palace centers. There may have been droughts, famines, disruptions to trade routes. Whatever the combination of causes, within a relatively short period the great palaces fell, were burned, or were abandoned. The linear B writing system disappeared. Long-distance trade contracted. The population declined. What followed is sometimes called the Greek Dark Ages, though the term is used cautiously, as it can suggest a more complete disappearance of culture than actually occurred. People continued to live in Greece during these centuries, roughly from about 1200 to 800 years before the Common Era. They kept flocks, grew crops, told stories. But the complexity of the palace system was gone. Villages were smaller and more isolated. Craft production simplified. Contact with distant regions became rare. It was a quieter, more inward time. Yet from this period of relative simplicity, something was slowly being prepared. The myths that the Mycenaeans and earlier Greeks had accumulated, stories of gods and heroes, of Troy and Thebes and the wandering sea voyage of Odysseus, were being preserved and enriched in the oral tradition. Poets and singers passed these stories from one generation to the next, shaping and refining them over many generations. And as the Dark Ages gradually gave way to renewed contact with the wider world, as trade picked up again and communities grew more complex, the Greeks emerged with a rich inherited store of stories and a set of social and cultural habits that would shape everything that came after. By around 800 years before the Common Era, the recovery was well underway. The Greek alphabet, adapted from the Phoenician script of the Eastern Mediterranean, was coming into use. Communities were growing larger and more organized. And the particular form of political and social organization that would define classical Greece, the polis, the city-state, was taking its characteristic shape. The polis was more than simply a city. It was a community of citizens bound together by shared laws, shared religious practice, and a common sense of identity. The physical center of the polis was often a fortified hilltop, the Acropolis, and a central open space for public gathering, the Agora. Around these gathered the temples, the administrative buildings, the workshops and homes of the citizens. The surrounding countryside, with its farms and villages, was part of the polis as well. Citizens might live in the countryside and travel to the city for festivals, assemblies, and markets. Each polis was sovereign, governing itself and managing its own affairs. There were hundreds of these city-states scattered across the Greek world, from the Black Sea coast in the north to the western coast of Anatolia, from the islands of the Aegean to the Greek colonies that had been established in Sicily, southern Italy, and along the coasts of northern Africa and southern France. Greeks settled widely across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea region, establishing new polis that maintained cultural and sometimes political ties with their founding cities while developing their own particular characters. Two of the most important and influential city-states were Athens and Sparta, and they were, in many ways, remarkably different from each other, though both were recognizably Greek. Athens lay in the region of Attica, in central Greece, close to the sea. It grew over time into one of the largest and most populous of the Greek city-states, with a diverse economy based on trade, craft production, silver mining, and agriculture. Sparta lay in the southern region of the Peloponnese, in a broad valley fertile enough to sustain a significant population without the need for extensive trade. What made these two cities different was not just their geography but the choices each made, over many generations, about how to organize their societies. Athens moved, gradually and with many complications, toward a system of government in which citizens participated directly in making decisions for the community. Sparta chose a different path, organizing its society around military strength and collective discipline in ways that were unusually intense even by ancient standards. These two city-states shaped much of the history of classical Greece, sometimes in cooperation, sometimes in competition, and ultimately in a long and damaging conflict that affected the entire Greek world. But before reaching those turbulent times, it is worth resting gently in the story of how Athens found its way to democracy. The development of Athenian democracy was not a sudden event. It was a slow and sometimes uncertain process, shaped by the particular pressures and conflicts of Athenian society over several generations. In the early period of Greek history, most polis were governed by small groups of aristocratic families who held land and political power. This kind of government is called oligarchy, rule by the few. Below the aristocrats were poorer free citizens, farmers, and craftsmen, who had little or no formal role in governing. In Athens, as the city grew and its economy became more diverse, tensions between the wealthy few and the broader population increased. In the late 7th century before the Common Era, a man named Draco was appointed to write down the laws of Athens, giving them a fixed and public form. Draco's laws were famously strict. It was said that they were written not in ink but in blood, but the act of writing them down was itself significant. It meant that the law was no longer simply whatever the powerful decided it was, but something that could be known and referred to by anyone. A generation or so later, a statesman named Solon was given extraordinary powers to reform the Athenian system. Solon cancelled debts that had reduced many Athenians to slavery, reorganized the classes of citizens, and created new institutions that gave a broader portion of the population some role in public life. He is remembered as a man who tried to find a middle way, who refused to let either the wealthy or the poor have everything they wanted, and who left Athens more balanced, if still imperfect. Further reforms followed. In the late 6th century, a man named Cleisthenes introduced changes that are often seen as the true foundation of Athenian democracy. He reorganized the citizen body into new tribes and demis, local community units, that cut across the old aristocratic family networks. He created a council of 500 citizens, chosen by lot, to manage the city's day-to-day affairs. He gave the citizen assembly, the ecclesia, real power to make decisions on important matters. The system was not yet the full democracy it would become, but it had taken a decisive shape. In the 5th century before the Common Era, the statesman Pericles, who dominated Athenian politics for several decades, extended democratic participation further. Under his guidance, payment was introduced for certain civic duties, which meant that even poorer citizens could afford to participate in public life without losing their income. The jury courts were expanded, and many thousands of citizens might serve on juries in a given year. Athenian democracy was a direct democracy, meaning that citizens did not vote for representatives but participated personally in the assembly, where they could speak and vote on matters of war and peace, public finance, legislation, and the conduct of public officials. The assembly met regularly on the hillside of the Pnyx, near the Acropolis. Any male citizen could attend and speak. Decisions were made by majority vote. It was a form of government that required active participation, and Athenians were, at least in the classical period, deeply engaged in public life. It is important to note, gently but clearly, that this democracy was limited. Women were not citizens and had no political role. Enslaved people, who made up a significant portion of the population and whose labor supported much of Athenian economic life, had no political standing. Foreigners who lived and worked in Athens but were not citizens, metics, as they were called, were also excluded. The democracy was real and remarkable for its time, but it was a democracy of a particular portion of the population, not of all who lived in Athens. Daily life in Athens was shaped by the rhythms of the seasons, the demands of agriculture, trade, and craft work, and the rich calendar of religious festivals that punctuated the year. For most Athenians, life was relatively modest. Homes were simple, built of mud brick, arranged around a central courtyard. The rooms were not large, and furnishings were spare. The most comfortable homes might have tiled floors and plastered walls, but most people lived simply. Food in Athens, as across much of the Greek world, centered on the fundamental ingredients of the Mediterranean: bread made from wheat or barley, olive oil, wine diluted with water, legumes, vegetables, and fish. Meat was eaten more rarely, often in connection with religious sacrifices, when animals were slaughtered at festivals and portions distributed to the participants. The sea provided an important supplement to the diet, and Athenians had access to a wide variety of fish and shellfish. The agora, the open central space of Athens, was the heart of public life. Here people came to buy and sell goods, to meet friends and conduct business, to watch the bustle of the city. The agora was also where many public institutions were located: the council house, the archive, various stoas, or covered walkways where people could shelter from the sun or rain and conduct conversations. Philosophers like Socrates walked in the agora and engaged passers-by in conversation. It was a place of continuous, gentle motion and exchange. Women's lives in Athens were generally more restricted than men's. Respectable Athenian women of citizen families were expected to manage the household, oversee the work of domestic slaves, and spend much of their time in the home. Their primary roles were those of wife and mother. Women of poorer families might work outside the home in various capacities, as market sellers or cloth workers, but their civic and public roles were limited. Women did participate in certain religious festivals and had important roles in religious life, including some priesthoods, but they did not vote or hold public office. Enslaved people in Athens came from many different origins: captured in war, born into slavery, purchased from traders who brought them from distant regions. They worked in a wide variety of roles, from domestic servants and craftspeople to agricultural laborers and miners. The silver mines at Laurion, which provided much of Athens's wealth, were worked by enslaved people in conditions that were genuinely difficult. The presence of enslaved labor throughout the economy was a quiet but constant feature of Athenian life, and it shaped the material conditions that allowed Athenian citizens the time for political participation, philosophical discussion, and cultural engagement. To understand the full picture of ancient Greece, one must turn southward and westward to the Peloponnese, to the broad valley of Laconia, where Sparta stood. Sparta, also known as Lacedaemon, was one of the most unusual societies in the ancient world, and its choices about how to organize collective life were different from almost anything else in the Greek world. Spartan society was organized around a single overriding priority: military strength. The Spartans believed that the stability and security of their community depended on maintaining a highly trained, disciplined, and cohesive warrior class. To achieve this, they developed an educational and social system unlike anything their contemporaries knew. At the center of Spartan life was the agoge, the system of public upbringing that all Spartan boys entered at the age of 7. When a boy reached this age, he left his family home and joined a group of his peers under the supervision of older boys and adult overseers. He lived in communal barracks, wore minimal clothing regardless of the weather, was given limited food, partly to teach endurance and partly to encourage the boys to develop the resourcefulness needed to supplement their rations, and underwent intensive physical and military training throughout his childhood and adolescence. The agoge was not simply about physical training. It also aimed to instill particular values: obedience to authority, loyalty to one's companions, endurance of hardship without complaint, and a kind of quiet courage that expressed itself not in words but in steadiness. Spartan culture distrusted elaborate speech and display. The word laconic, meaning brief and to the point, comes from Laconia, the region where Sparta was located. Spartans were known for speaking plainly and saying much in few words. Young men who completed the agoge continued to live in communal groups and take their meals together in common messes, syssitia, even after they were married. This arrangement lasted until a man was about 30 years old. The bond between members of these communal groups was meant to create the kind of deep mutual trust and loyalty that would hold in battle. Spartan women lived differently from women elsewhere in Greece. They were expected to be physically fit, to exercise, to manage the household and estate while their husbands were occupied with military training and service. They had more freedom of movement and more authority within the home than women in Athens. This was not because Spartan society was unusually progressive in its attitudes toward women, but because practical necessity demanded it. With men largely occupied by military life, women had to be capable of running things. The social structure of Sparta was more complex than it might first appear. Beneath the Spartan citizens, who were called Spartiates, were two other groups. The Parioikoi were free people who lived in communities surrounding Sparta. They were not citizens, could not participate in Spartan politics, but served in the military and engaged in trade and craft production that Spartan citizens themselves did not practice. The Helots were an entirely different matter. The Helots were the original population of Laconia and the neighboring region of Messenia, whom the Spartans had conquered and reduced to a condition of collective servitude. They worked the land and provided the agricultural surplus that freed Spartan citizens from farm labor, allowing them to focus on military training. The Helots outnumbered the Spartans considerably, and this imbalance was a source of constant anxiety for Sparta. The need to keep the Helot population controlled was one of the reasons Sparta maintained such intense military preparation. Between Athens and Sparta, and among all the other city-states of Greece, there was rarely simple peace. Competition for influence, resources, and prestige was constant. Alliances formed and dissolved. Wars between neighboring poleis were not uncommon, though they often followed a relatively ritualized pattern, with armies of citizen soldiers meeting in open battle, settling the immediate question, and then returning home. There were also, however, moments when Greek communities faced an external threat so large that it required, at least temporarily, a different kind of response. The Persian Wars were such a moment. By the early 5th century before the Common Era, the Persian Empire was the largest and most powerful state in the known world. It stretched from the eastern Mediterranean to the borders of India, encompassing an enormous diversity of peoples, languages, and cultures, all under the authority of a single king. The Greeks of the western coast of Anatolia, in a region called Ionia, had long been part of the Greek world, but they found themselves under Persian control after Persian expansion reached the Aegean coast. In around 499 BCE, the Ionian Greeks rose in revolt against their Persian overlords, and Athens sent ships to support them. The revolt was ultimately suppressed, but the Persian king Darius did not forget the Athenian involvement. In 490 BCE, he sent a Persian fleet and army across the Aegean with the intention of punishing Athens and extending Persian control into mainland Greece. The Persian force landed on the plain of Marathon, northeast of Athens, and there they were met by the Athenian army, with a small contingent from the city of Plataea. What happened at Marathon was, in terms of its strategic outcome, a relatively contained engagement. The Athenians, outnumbered but fighting with disciplined courage on terrain they knew, attacked the Persian line and drove them back to their ships with significant losses. The Persians withdrew. Athens had defended itself. The victory at Marathon became one of the most celebrated events in Athenian history and reinforced Athenian confidence in their citizen soldiers and their capacity for collective self-defense. 10 years later, the Persians returned, this time under King Xerxes himself, with a force vastly larger than the one that had come before. The scale of the Persian expedition was such that even the Greeks' sense of their own accomplishment in resisting it carried a tone of quiet wonder. The Persian army crossed from Asia into Europe on a bridge of boats laid across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating the two continents. Faced with this threat, a number of Greek city-states set aside, at least for a time, their usual rivalries and formed a defensive alliance. Athens and Sparta were among the most important members, along with Corinth and several others. The alliance recognized that the Persian force was too large for any single city-state to resist alone. The Persian army moved southward through northern Greece, and at the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae, a Greek force attempted to hold them back. The Greeks defending the pass were led by the Spartan king Leonidas, who had brought 300 Spartan warriors along with several thousand allied troops from other Greek cities. For 2 days, the Greek force held the pass against repeated Persian attacks. On the 3rd day, a local resident showed the Persians a path through the mountains that allowed them to outflank the defenders. Leonidas sent most of the allied troops away but remained himself with his 300 Spartans and a number of Thespians and the bands. They fought until they were killed. The stand at Thermopylae did not stop the Persian advance, but it became, in Greek memory and later in world memory, a symbol of courage and sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds. The Spartans in particular remembered it as an example of everything their training and values were meant to produce: the willingness to hold one's position without yielding, regardless of the cost. The Persians continued southward, reached Athens, and burned the city, including the temples on the Acropolis. The Athenians had largely evacuated before the Persians arrived, following the advice of the statesman Themistocles, who had persuaded them that their best defense lay not in their walls but in their ships. The Athenian fleet was significant, having been built up with the proceeds from the silver mines at Laurion, and Themistocles argued that the sea was where the decisive confrontation would come. That confrontation came in the narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the Athenian coast. The Persian fleet, large but hampered by the confined waters, found itself at a disadvantage against the more maneuverable Greek triremes. The Battle of Salamis was a decisive Greek victory. The Persian naval power was broken, and without the ability to supply his army reliably by sea, Xerxes withdrew much of his force back to Asia. The remaining Persian army was defeated the following year at the Battle of Plataea, on the plain of Boeotia, and the Persian threat to mainland Greece effectively ended. The aftermath of the Persian Wars reshaped the Greek world in quiet but significant ways. Athens emerged from the wars with greatly enhanced prestige and confidence. Its navy had been central to the victory at Salamis, and this naval power became the basis for an expanding Athenian empire in the decades that followed. Athens organized a league of allied city-states, originally conceived as a continuing defensive alliance against Persia, but which gradually became an instrument of Athenian power. Allied cities contributed ships or money, and the money increasingly flowed to Athens, where it funded an extraordinary building program and the cultural flowering that we now call the Golden Age. The Golden Age of Athens reached its fullest expression in the middle decades of the 5th century, during the long period of Pericles' political dominance. Pericles was not a king or a tyrant but a democratic politician who won the trust of the Athenian assembly through his eloquence, his judgment, and his vision for what Athens might become. Under his guidance, Athens became the most visible and celebrated city in the Greek world, known for its art, its architecture, its philosophy, and its democratic institutions. The most visible expression of this golden age was the building program on the Acropolis. The Persian sack had left the hill's earlier temples in ruins, and Pericles organized a rebuilding on a scale that was deliberately ambitious. At the center of the program was the Parthenon, a temple dedicated to the goddess Athena Parthenos, Athena the Virgin, who was the patron deity of Athens. The Parthenon was built between 447 and 432 BCE under the direction of the architects Ictinus and Callicrates, and the sculptor Phidias oversaw its decorative program. It was built of fine white marble brought from the nearby quarries of Mount Pentelicus. The temple followed the classical Greek form, a rectangular building surrounded by columns, but it incorporated subtle refinements that gave it a particular grace. The columns were not perfectly straight but curved ever so slightly, swelling in the middle and tapering toward the top. The horizontal surfaces of the floor and the entablature were not perfectly flat but curved gently upward toward the center. These refinements, so subtle that they are barely visible to the eye, were designed to counteract optical illusions that would otherwise make perfectly straight lines appear slightly bent. Inside the Parthenon stood a colossal statue of Athena, created by Phidias and made of gold and ivory, the gold used for the goddess's clothing and the ivory for her skin. The exterior of the temple was decorated with carved marble reliefs showing mythological scenes, the battle of the Lapiths and Centaurs, the birth of Athena, the contest between Athena and Poseidon for the patronage of Athens. Along the inner wall at the top ran a long continuous frieze showing the Panathenaic procession, the great festival in honor of Athena held every 4 years. Citizens, horsemen, musicians, and animals for sacrifice moved in quiet procession across the stone. The Parthenon was not the only building on the Acropolis. The Propylaea, a grand entrance gateway, was built at the same time. The Erechtheion, with its famous porch of the Caryatids, columns carved in the form of standing women, was built nearby. The temple of Athena Nike stood on a small bastion overlooking the approach to the hill. Together these buildings made the Acropolis one of the most architecturally refined spaces in the ancient world. Greek architecture in its classical form was governed by a sense of proportion and harmony that expressed a broader cultural ideal. The 3 architectural orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, each represented a slightly different approach to the relationship between the structural elements of a building, but all shared a commitment to clarity, balance, and the proper relation of parts to whole. This architectural sensibility spread with Greek culture throughout the Mediterranean world and has echoed through architectural traditions down to the present day. The arts flourished in Athens during this period in ways that extended far beyond architecture. Greek sculpture of the classical period developed a particular ideal of the human form, poised, harmonious, conveying both physical beauty and a kind of inner calm. Earlier Greek sculpture had been relatively stiff and formal, but over the course of the 5th century, sculptors developed the ability to show figures in relaxed, natural poses, with a sense of weight and movement that earlier work had not achieved. Greek pottery, decorated with scenes from mythology and daily life, was produced in large quantities and traded widely. The red figure style, developed in Athens around the end of the 6th century, allowed for greater naturalism in the depiction of figures and became the dominant form of vase painting in the classical period. These painted pots were not simply decorative objects but functional vessels used in everyday life and in ritual contexts, and they preserve for us a remarkable visual record of ancient Greek life and story. Greek theatre was another art form that reached its height in classical Athens. The theatre at Athens was closely connected with religious festival, particularly the festivals of Dionysus, the god of wine and transformation. During these festivals, dramatic performances were presented in a large open-air theatre on the southern slope of the Acropolis, before audiences that could number in the thousands. The plays were competitions, with different playwrights presenting their works and prizes awarded by a panel of judges. The great tragedians of 5th century Athens, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, explored in their plays the deepest questions of human experience, the relationship between human beings and the gods, the meaning of justice and suffering, the nature of pride and its consequences, the bonds and conflicts of family loyalty. Aeschylus, the earliest of the 3, dramatized the Oresteia, a trilogy exploring the cycle of vengeance in the house of Atreus and its resolution through the establishment of legal justice. Sophocles gave us Oedipus and Antigone, figures whose struggles with fate and duty continue to resonate with audiences thousands of years later. Euripides approached his subjects with a psychological depth and a willingness to question received values that made his work both admired and controversial in his own time. Greek comedy also flourished in this period, particularly in the work of Aristophanes, whose surviving plays mix sharp political satire with broad humor, fantasy, and genuine poetic beauty. The comedies of Aristophanes give us glimpses of Athenian public life, its concerns and controversies, its personalities and debates, that complement the more formal record of history. The intellectual life of Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries reached its greatest expression in philosophy. Philosophy, the love of wisdom, was a distinctive Greek contribution to human thought, an attempt to understand the world and human life through reason and argument rather than through myth or religious authority alone. The tradition of Greek philosophy is long and varied, but three figures stand out with particular quiet significance: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates was an Athenian citizen of the 5th century who left no writings of his own. What we know of him comes primarily through the dialogues of his student Plato, and through other accounts by those who knew him. Socrates worked as a stonecutter, or perhaps a sculptor, but he devoted much of his life to philosophical conversation, engaging his fellow Athenians in discussions about virtue, justice, piety, courage, and the nature of knowledge. His method was distinctive. He would approach someone who claimed to know about justice, or beauty, or courage, and through careful questioning reveal that the knowledge they thought they had was actually much more uncertain than they had assumed. This method, which later became known as the Socratic method, was not designed to humiliate or defeat the person being questioned, but to arrive at a more honest understanding of where genuine knowledge lay and where uncertainty began. Socrates believed, or so Plato presents him as believing, that wisdom began with the recognition of one's own ignorance. His famous statement that he knew nothing, or knew only that he knew nothing, was not simply a rhetorical flourish but a genuine philosophical position about the difficulty and importance of honest self-examination. Socrates gathered around him a circle of admirers and students, many of them from prominent Athenian families. But his method also made enemies. His questioning could seem to undermine established beliefs and authorities, and in 399 BCE, after Athens had lost the Peloponnesian War and was in a period of political tension and uncertainty, he was put on trial on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. He was convicted by a jury of his fellow citizens and sentenced to death. He drank hemlock and died in the company of his friends, as described in Plato's account of his final hours. His death became one of the most discussed events in the history of philosophy, a quiet but enduring question about the relationship between individual conscience and community authority. Plato, who was present at or near many of the events surrounding Socrates' trial and death, spent the rest of his long life working through the philosophical questions that his teacher had raised. Plato wrote in the form of dialogues, with Socrates typically as the main speaker, exploring questions in ethics, metaphysics, epistemology, politics, and the nature of the soul. His dialogues are not simply records of Socratic conversation but deeply worked philosophical texts, among the most carefully constructed and intellectually rich writings to survive from antiquity. Plato's most famous idea is perhaps the theory of forms or ideas, the notion that the world of sensory experience, the things we see and touch and taste, are imperfect reflections of a higher, unchanging reality that can be apprehended by the mind through philosophical reasoning. Justice, beauty, equality, these are not simply human conventions, Plato believed, but real, eternal forms that exist beyond the material world. True knowledge is knowledge of these forms, and the philosopher's life is the life oriented toward this higher reality. In the Republic, Plato imagined an ideal city governed by philosophers, those who had achieved genuine understanding of justice and the good. The Republic is a complex and nuanced work, exploring not only the ideal organization of political life but also the nature of the soul, the purpose of education, and the relationship between knowledge, virtue, and happiness. It is a text that has been discussed, debated, and reinterpreted continuously since it was written, more than 2,000 years ago. Aristotle was Plato's student, having come to Athens as a young man from his home city of Stagae in northern Greece to study at Plato's school, the Academy. He remained there for about 20 years, and after Plato's death he eventually established his own school in Athens, the Lyceum. Aristotle was an extraordinarily prolific thinker, writing on subjects that included logic, natural science, biology, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetics, and metaphysics. Much of what he wrote has been lost, but what survives constitutes one of the most comprehensive bodies of thought produced by any single person in the ancient world. Aristotle approached the study of the natural world with a particular combination of systematic observation and careful categorization. He studied animals with a thoroughness and precision that was unprecedented. He classified living things, observed their anatomy and behavior, and attempted to understand their nature in terms of their functions and purposes. His biological work remained authoritative for many centuries and contained observations of genuine accuracy and insight alongside ideas that later science would revise. In ethics, Aristotle developed a view of the good life, eudaimonia, often translated as happiness or flourishing, as one in which a person exercises the distinctive capacities of human beings well, in accordance with reason and virtue. Virtue, for Aristotle, was not simply a matter of following rules but a condition of character, a stable disposition to feel and act in appropriate ways that was developed through practice and habit. His discussion of particular virtues, courage, generosity, justice, and the rest, tried to understand each one as a kind of balance between extremes, a middle way between too much and too little of a relevant quality. Aristotle's political thought saw the polis as the natural form of human community, the context in which human beings could most fully develop and exercise their capacities. He studied the constitutions of a large number of Greek city-states and tried to understand the conditions that made different forms of government stable or unstable, just or unjust. His politics is empirical as well as normative. It tries to understand how things are as well as how they should be. The philosophical tradition that Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle established became one of the most enduring intellectual legacies of ancient Greece. Their works were preserved, studied, and commented on through the centuries, transmitted through the Byzantine world to the Islamic world and then back to Western Europe during the Renaissance. The questions they asked and the methods they developed for addressing those questions shaped the subsequent history of thought in ways that are still quietly present in contemporary inquiry. The decades that followed the Persian Wars and the Golden Age of Athens were not peaceful ones. The growth of Athenian power, expressed through its increasingly dominant role in the Delian League and its assertive foreign policy, created anxiety and resentment among other Greek city-states, particularly Sparta and its Peloponnesian allies. The rivalry between the two great powers, Athens and Sparta, had been managed carefully during the Persian Wars, but it was always present, and by the middle of the 5th century it began to press more insistently toward open conflict. The Peloponnesian War, which lasted from 431 to 404 BCE with some interruptions, was the great tragedy of classical Greece. It pitted Athens and its allies against Sparta and the Peloponnesian League in a conflict that drew in nearly the entire Greek world and ultimately exhausted the strength of both sides. The war has been documented in extraordinary detail by the Athenian historian Thucydides, whose account is one of the greatest works of historical writing ever produced, calm and precise in its observation of the ways that power, fear, and ambition shape political decision. The two sides in the war had quite different strengths. Athens was strong at sea, with the largest and most capable navy in the Greek world. Sparta was strong on land, with its professional citizen soldiers who had trained for war throughout their lives. The early strategy of Athens, as recommended by Pericles, was to avoid major land battles against the Spartan army, concentrate on defending the city and maintaining its sea communications, and wear down the Spartans through raids and economic pressure. The strategy was cautious but defensible. An early complication was a severe plague that struck Athens in the second year of the war, having arrived perhaps from Egypt via the port of Piraeus. The plague killed large numbers of Athenians, including Pericles himself, and shook Athenian confidence and social cohesion. In the years that followed, Athenian policy became less consistent and more subject to the shifting moods of the assembly. The most consequential of these shifts was the decision to send a large expedition to Sicily with the goal of conquering Syracuse, the largest Greek city on the island. The Sicilian expedition, launched in 415 BCE, was an enormous undertaking, a large fleet and army sent to operate far from home. It ended in catastrophic failure. The Athenian force was trapped, defeated on both land and sea, and largely destroyed. The generals were killed and most of the soldiers captured and put to work in the quarries outside Syracuse under conditions that were terrible. The loss of so many men and ships was a blow from which Athens never fully recovered. Sparta, with Persian financial support now helping to build a navy, was eventually able to challenge Athens at sea. In 405 BC, a Spartan fleet destroyed the last Athenian fleet at Aegospotami, and Sparta's victory was complete. Athens surrendered in 404 BC, its long walls torn down, its empire dissolved, its democratic government temporarily replaced. The aftermath of the Peloponnesian War left the Greek world weaker, more fragmented, and less capable of unified action than it had been. Sparta attempted to exercise the kind of hegemony over Greece that Athens had once enjoyed but proved better at war than at diplomacy and governance. Other city-states, Thebes, Corinth, resisted Spartan dominance. Conflicts continued. The generation following the Peloponnesian War was one of continuing instability, as various city-states sought to expand their influence or maintain their independence. None achieved the sustained dominance that would bring stability to the Greek world. It was from the north, from a region that the southern Greeks had long regarded as somewhat peripheral to their own world, that the next great transformation of the Greek world would come. Macedonia was a kingdom in northern Greece, occupying a broad territory of plains and foothills. Its people spoke a dialect of Greek and shared many Greek cultural practices, but they were governed by kings rather than by the citizen assemblies of the southern polis, and they had a somewhat different social structure and way of life. Philip II, who became king of Macedonia in 359 BCE, was one of the most capable and energetic rulers of the ancient world. He reorganized the Macedonian army, developing new tactical formations and combining infantry, cavalry, and siege equipment in ways that gave his force capabilities that Greek citizen armies could not match. He extended Macedonian control over neighboring regions, bringing Thessaly, Thrace, and eventually much of mainland Greece under his influence. The southern Greek city-states resisted, but Philip's combination of military skill and diplomatic subtlety proved effective. In 338 BCE, at the Battle of Chaeronea in Boeotia, Philip's army defeated a coalition of Greek city-states including Athens and Thebes, effectively establishing Macedonian supremacy over mainland Greece. Philip's son, Alexander, was present at Chaeronea and had commanded the cavalry that broke the Theban sacred band, an elite Theban military unit. Alexander had been educated by Aristotle. Philip had specifically invited the philosopher to come to Macedon to serve as tutor to the young prince, and combined an intense engagement with Greek culture and thought with the military training and ambition that his Macedonian background provided. In 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated at a celebration in his own court, and Alexander, who was 20 years old, became king. He moved quickly to secure his position, suppressing a brief rebellion among some of the Greek city-states and then turning his attention to the east. His father had been planning an expedition against the Persian Empire, framed partly as revenge for the Persian invasions of Greece a century and a half earlier. Alexander took up this project and expanded it enormously. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with an army of Macedonians and Greeks. What followed was one of the most remarkable military campaigns in recorded history. Over the course of the next 11 years, Alexander's army moved eastward through Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, Central Asia, and eventually into the Indus Valley of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Along the way he defeated Persian armies at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, captured the great cities of Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, and Ecbatana, founded numerous new cities bearing his name, and extended his personal authority over a territory larger than any previously united under a single ruler. Alexander was not simply a conqueror. He was genuinely interested in the cultures he encountered, curious about the peoples he came into contact with, and willing to adopt local customs and incorporate local traditions into his own practice. He dressed in Persian robes, incorporated Persian nobles into his court and administration, encouraged his Macedonian officers to marry Persian women at a mass ceremony at Susa, and attempted to create a court that could be understood as belonging to multiple cultural traditions simultaneously. This cultural blending was not universally welcomed. Some of Alexander's Macedonian companions resented what they saw as an abandonment of Macedonian identity and a too great deference to Persian ways. There were tensions, conspiracies, and at times outbreaks of violence within Alexander's immediate circle. The campaign was not simply a smooth progression of victories but a complex human undertaking with all the friction and conflict that such an enterprise produces. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, at the age of 32, of causes that are still debated by historians: fever following illness, perhaps, or perhaps the cumulative effects of his wounds and the physical demands of years of campaigning. He left no clear successor, and his empire was divided after his death among his generals, the Diadochi, the successors, who fought among themselves for decades before a relatively stable arrangement emerged with several large kingdoms occupying different portions of the former empire. This period following Alexander's death is known as the Hellenistic era, and it lasted until the Roman conquest brought the last of the Hellenistic kingdoms under Roman control in the 1st century BCE. The Hellenistic world was characterized by the spread of Greek language and culture across the eastern Mediterranean and into the Near East, mixed with and transformed by the local traditions of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and other regions. It was a cosmopolitan world, in which different cultural traditions existed in close contact, influencing and modifying each other in quiet, ongoing ways. To rest for a moment from the sweep of wars and politics and philosophical abstraction, it is worth considering the texture of ordinary daily life in ancient Greece, the small details that filled the hours of people who were not generals or philosophers but farmers, craftspeople, merchants, and families making their way through the seasons. A Greek home in the classical period was typically built around a central courtyard, open to the sky, which served as the primary source of light and air for the surrounding rooms. The courtyard might have a small garden, a well, an altar for domestic religious observances. Rooms opened off the courtyard: a kitchen, storage rooms, a dining room where the men of the household would receive guests, and in larger homes, a separate women's quarter. Floors were usually of packed earth, sometimes covered with tiles or mosaic in wealthier homes. Walls were plastered and sometimes painted. Furniture was modest: low beds with mattresses of woven straps and cushions, wooden chairs and stools, chests for storage. Greek food was simple and seasonal. Bread was the staple, made from wheat or barley and baked in clay ovens. Olives and olive oil were fundamental. Oil was used for cooking, for lighting lamps, for cleaning the body after exercise, for anointing the dead. Wine, always diluted with water, was drunk at meals and at the symposium, the formal dinner gathering that was an important institution of male social life. At the symposium, men reclined on couches, drinking wine and engaging in conversation, poetry recitation, and philosophical discussion. The symposium had its own rituals and etiquette, and it was at these gatherings that much of the lyric poetry and philosophical dialogue of ancient Greece was produced and enjoyed. The religious life of ancient Greeks was woven through every aspect of daily experience. The gods were not distant or abstract but present in specific places, associated with particular activities and aspects of life. Zeus, the king of the gods, was associated with thunder, with kingship, with the ordering of divine and human affairs. Athena presided over wisdom, crafts, and warfare of the strategic kind. Apollo was the god of light, prophecy, music, and healing. Aphrodite presided over love and beauty. Poseidon governed the sea. Demeter was the goddess of grain and the harvest. Each deity had temples, festivals, and particular rituals associated with them, and the relationship between the community and its gods was maintained through regular observances, sacrifices, prayers, processions, the offerings of first fruits at harvest. The gods of Greek religion were not perfectly good or perfectly benevolent in the way that monotheistic traditions sometimes describe their deities. They were powerful and sometimes capricious, capable of jealousy and anger, bound by their own traditions and obligations, and sometimes at odds with each other. Myths about the gods explored these tensions and complexities, showing divine figures engaged in conflicts and love affairs, in schemes and reconciliations, that mirrored in a heightened way the complexity of human life. Myth was not simply entertainment, though it was certainly that as well. Myths explained the origin of things, why certain places were sacred, why certain practices were observed, how the world came to be ordered as it is. They provided models for understanding extreme situations, how to face death, how to deal with fate, what loyalty and betrayal mean, what the limits of human power are. The great cycles of myth, the Trojan War, the labors of Heracles, the voyage of the Argonauts, the story of Oedipus, were known throughout the Greek world and provided a shared imaginative vocabulary that connected communities across the fragmented geography of the Greek-speaking world. The Olympic Games were another shared institution that expressed the Greek sense of common identity. Held every 4 years at Olympia in the western Peloponnese, the Games were a religious festival in honor of Zeus as well as an athletic competition. They were Panhellenic, open to all Greeks, and a sacred truce was declared during the period of the Games, allowing travelers from all parts of the Greek world to attend safely. The competitions at Olympia included running events of various distances, wrestling, boxing, the pankration, a combination of wrestling and striking, the pentathlon, chariot racing, and horse racing. Victory at Olympia was one of the highest honors a Greek man could achieve. Victors received crowns of olive leaves, but the real prizes were the glory and prestige that followed them home, the odes that great poets like Pindar composed in their honor, the statues erected in their home cities, the privileges and honors extended to them for the rest of their lives. The Games were held continuously from 776 BCE, the traditional date of the first Olympiad, until the late 4th century CE, when they were suppressed under Christian Roman rule after more than 1,000 years of observance. The legacy of ancient Greece is not a simple or static thing. It is not a set of fixed doctrines or practices that passed unchanged from the ancient world to the present. It is more like a conversation, a long, rich, sometimes contradictory conversation that has been going on for many centuries, about what it means to think carefully, to govern justly, to make beautiful things, to live well. The Romans absorbed Greek culture with particular intensity, learning Greek, studying Greek philosophy and rhetoric, collecting Greek art, and adapting Greek literary forms for their own purposes. Roman temples and public buildings were deeply influenced by Greek architectural forms. Roman philosophical schools, Stoicism, Epicureanism, Skepticism, had their roots in Greek philosophical traditions. Latin literature was self-consciously in dialogue with its Greek predecessors. When Western Europe emerged from the early medieval period and contact with ancient texts was renewed, partly through Arabic translations that had preserved much of what might otherwise have been lost, it was again to Greece and Rome that scholars looked for models and inspiration. The Renaissance was in many ways a sustained engagement with the classical inheritance, a rediscovery of ancient texts and artistic forms, and an attempt to understand what the ancient world had achieved and what it might offer to the present. In science, the Greek tradition of rational inquiry, the attempt to explain natural phenomena through observation and logical reasoning rather than through appeal to divine intervention, laid groundwork for later scientific development. Greek mathematics, particularly the work of Euclid, remained the foundation of mathematical education for many centuries. Greek astronomy, particularly the work of Ptolemy, shaped the understanding of the cosmos until the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. Aristotle's natural philosophical approach, careful observation, systematic classification, and the search for underlying causes influenced natural inquiry throughout the medieval and early modern periods. In medicine, the tradition associated with Hippocrates of Kos, a physician of the 5th century BCE, developed practices of careful observation of patients and their symptoms and an attempt to understand illness in terms of natural rather than supernatural causes. The Hippocratic tradition emphasized that the physician should observe carefully, intervene gently, and above all do no harm, principles that have resonated through the history of medicine. In literature and the arts, the Greek tradition has been a continuous source of inspiration. The Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, composed in their written form probably in the 8th century BCE, though drawing on a much older oral tradition, have been read, translated, and reinterpreted in every subsequent era of Western literary culture. Greek tragedy has been performed and adapted continuously, with new productions finding new meanings in these ancient works. The Greek ideal of human form in sculpture, the Greek sense of architectural proportion and harmony, the Greek tradition of lyric poetry, all have left traces in artistic traditions far removed in time and space from their origins. Democratic ideas, with all their complications and limitations, trace one of their most important lines of descent to the Athenian experiment. The idea that citizens should participate in governing themselves, that laws should be made with public input and applied to everyone, that office holders should be accountable to the community, these ideas were worked out in Athens in ways that influenced subsequent thinking about politics even when the specific institutions were very different. Philosophy in the broadest sense, the practice of asking careful questions about knowledge, ethics, and the nature of reality, and working through those questions with sustained argument, continues in traditions that trace their intellectual ancestry to Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and the other Greek thinkers of antiquity. The questions they asked have not been finally answered, and the methods they developed for approaching those questions remain part of the way serious inquiry is conducted. What is perhaps most remarkable about the Greek achievement is not any single contribution but the combination of curiosity and rigor that characterized their best work. The Greeks were willing to ask fundamental questions about how the world came to be, about how people should live, about what is beautiful, about what justice requires, and to pursue those questions with both imagination and discipline. They did not always agree with each other, and their answers were often contradictory and sometimes wrong. But the practice of asking deeply, of not accepting easy answers, of subjecting received wisdom to careful examination, this is a quality that the Greek tradition introduced into the world's intellectual life in a particularly clear and enduring way. The stones of the Parthenon still stand, although altered by time and by the uses the building was put to in later centuries. The olive trees still grow on the hillsides of Attica. The sea still moves with the same unhurried rhythm around the islands of the Aegean. The light still falls in the early morning across the quiet ruins of the Agora, where Socrates once walked and asked his gentle, probing questions. Something of what happened in this small, fragmented, remarkable piece of the world between roughly 800 and 300 years before the Common Era continues to move through the culture of the present, sometimes visibly, sometimes in ways so quiet and deeply embedded that we barely notice. The tradition is alive not as a museum piece but as a set of questions and practices and imaginative resources that continue to be useful, continue to challenge, continue to invite reflection. Ancient Greece was not a perfect world. Its achievements were built on the labor of enslaved people whose names and stories are largely lost to us. It excluded women from political life. Its city-states spent much of their history in destructive conflict with each other. Its democracy was limited and sometimes turned against its best minds, as the execution of Socrates reminds us. To remember ancient Greece honestly is to hold these things alongside the beauty of the Parthenon and the depth of Platonic thought and the extraordinary courage shown at Thermopylae and Salamis. But it is also to recognize that something emerged from that fragmented, argumentative, curious, creative world that proved to be of lasting value. An inheritance of thought and form and inquiry that has been drawn upon by many peoples and traditions in many different times and places. A conversation that began on those hillsides and in those harbor towns and in those open courtyards under the blue Mediterranean sky, and that has never quite come to rest. The mountains of Greece rise in the same quiet way they always have, gray-green in the morning light, the sea beyond them still and pale. The old names echo gently across the landscape. The questions remain open, as questions worth asking always do. And the world that grew partly from this small, ancient beginning continues, slowly, to find its way.